Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Good guess, but wrong.
All right, well, welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm joined by Chad Gross. Greetings, Chad.
What's going on? How are you?
Good, good. Right, I've got 5 questions for you.
All right.
All right.
Yes. And then I have, after you're done with your 5 questions, I have a super quick, but I think super interesting fact I learned about Ghostbusters. But go ahead.
What's one item that can be found in your garbage can right now?
An empty croissant box. Yes, and I didn't eat any of them. I think I had one piece, like a little corner of one, and my girls ate the rest of them. They love croissants.
Oh, croissant. What's something you never had as a child that you would want to give to your own children?
You know, I know this sounds sentimental or cheesy perhaps, but my dad, because he was so busy, he worked in retail. I didn't have a lot of one-on-one time with my dad growing up. And so I whenever I did have that time, I still remember it and cherish it. But I would want to give them a lot of one-on-one time or even time with just me and them.
Correct answer. What's something that you've done or made that you're proud of?
So when Lily was 2 or 3 years old, she was very into trains. And I actually I was at a craft store with Danielle Michaels or AC Moore, a place like that. And they had these little ornaments you can make. And one of them was a train. And I actually built it myself and painted it. And it still gets put on our tree every year. And for those who know me, I'm not the handiest person. So I was super proud of that.
Cool. Okay. You see a police car in your rearview mirror. What's the first emotion that you feel? And the lights are flashing.
Kind of that pit in my stomach. and then the first thought I have is how much is this going to cost?
Yeah,
does that answer the question?
Like, even if I know, even if a police car is coming at you, you're like, oh,
Yes.
And you're not doing anything wrong, but you're like checking everything. Like, wow.
Actually, it's funny you asked me that because literally 2 days ago, I was driving with Danielle in the car and there was a police officer on the other side of the road and he was sitting there, probably had the radar gun out checking for speeders. And she said, Chad, there's a cop there. And I said, oh, it's OK. I'm not speeding. She said, oh, I know. I just wanted you to know he was there. So she must have that feeling as well.
OK, number 5. What kind of music makes you want to get up and dance?
OK, this is an embarrassing one to admit. I have to admit, this is painful for me. You're making me do this publicly. This is going to hurt. OK, so I generally, and my girls and I have this conversation often, I generally hate modern pop music. I think the lyrics are, for the most part, trash. And I think much of it sounds exactly the same. And it just seems like artists are like a copy of you can point at an artist and say, oh, they're just like so-and-so 10 years ago, that kind of thing. Or maybe not 10 years ago, but you get the idea. But the song by Justin Timberlake, oh, what is it called? It was in the movie Trolls. Can't Stop the Feeling by Justin Timberlake. Man, it does not matter where I hear that song. I just immediately want to dance. I love that song. And I just think it's what pop music should be. It's lighthearted. It's fun. It doesn't take itself so cotton picking seriously. And for whatever reason, I would say that's how I'd have to answer that song.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to go Google that one. I don't know it.
Yeah. And the video as well is just really fun. It's all these people, just regular people at their jobs kind of dancing. And then by the end of the video, they're all dancing with him. And it's fun and lighthearted and just makes you feel good.
All right. Well, that'll be our theme song for next week.
Sweet.
For those who are listening and wondering where I get these great questions, Chad asked me 5 questions in the last me and him episode. And so I remembered only just as we hit record, oh, I was going to ask him 5 questions. Well, I have this thing on my phone called Game Words. It's an iOS
on the Apple platform, Game Words, and actually use it with the kids. It has charades topics, Pictionary topics, catchphrase. This one I got these questions from is called Get to Know You. There's subjects, there's wordplay, holidays, movies, stuff like that. And it basically just generates a bunch of topics. So the kids love it for charades. And one time we were like sitting around the campfire and I pulled out the questions. Now there's like light questions and then deeper questions and stuff. And they just wanted to go forever. So it's kind of a handy app for,
And the kids love it.
The kids love it.
All right. So I have to share with you a Ghostbusters fact that I learned that I just thought was ridiculous.
Oh, by the way, I just have to say the good content is coming. The good content is coming.
It is.
Right after this.
This is just where Brian and I talk about things that some are entertained by and some find pointless. So do you remember the cartoon? I know you weren't a fan, or you didn't watch it. I shouldn't say you weren't a fan, but The Real Ghostbusters?
I know of it, yes.
Okay, yeah. So it was in 1986. It ran from 1986 to 1991. And in the last episode, I said I still watch cartoons. That's one of them that I still watch. But I read in an interview when Afterlife was coming out, and there were so many different interviews and stuff. And then, of course, the algorithms on your phone pick things up, and then you start getting suggested articles and things like that. I read an interview with Ernie Hudson. For those of you that are sad and don't know Ghostbusters, he played Winston Zedmore, and he actually auditioned for the part of Winston in the cartoon. Okay, first of all, why did he have to audition? But that's a whole other thing. But he auditioned and they picked Arsenio Hall instead of him.
Wow.
Why? And it was really funny in the interview because he said, was I not Winston enough for them or what? So I just thought that was fascinating. I mean, that he literally shows up and says, I'd like to be the voice of my character. And they said, nah, we're going to go with Arsenio instead.
Wow, maybe they were trying to just make it really light and fun or something for kids.
Well, I was also wondering if it was perhaps because Arsenio might draw in more people at the time. But I just think but then I thought about it more and I thought, yeah, but for fans of the movie, having him would have brought people in. So I don't get it. Yeah, I just thought that was like one of those crazy facts that you think that can't be true. But that
is weird. All right.
Oh, man.
Okay, so we're on to part 2 of our logic primer. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about thinking after that. But if you remember last time we talked about sort of the intro to logic, what is logic? It's at the most basic level. It's examining propositions, arguments, premises, and conclusions, right thinking. And we talked about how a logical thinker is concerned about precision and clarity in communication. If you haven't listened to that, go back and listen to it or go to the show notes for the resources we provide. But now we're going to discuss some of the building blocks in the study of logic. So in general, everything else is built upon these essentials. So we talked earlier about things it's built on. Here's the first building block, the proposition. What's the proposition? It's something that may be asserted or denied. Propositions can be true or false. Therefore, they have a truth value. In other words, a proposition is a true or false statement that says something about reality. Cows give milk. Dogs bark. It's either true or false statements. Just says something about reality. Or you could say, clouds are green. Well, is that true or false? It is not an argument. It's just a proposition. Other statements like these commands, like get me a drink of water, or questions like what's your favorite kind of cat, or exclamations, they're not true or false. They're not propositions. So propositions is simply saying something about reality or the world, and it's either true or false. So that's your first building block. Any questions?
No, I'm tracking.
Good. Give me a drink of water. An argument is any group of propositions of which one is claimed to follow from the others, which are regarded as providing support or grounds for the truth of that one. So it's sort of like when you add up a couple statements, then you come up with something else from those statements. That's an argument. An argument is any group of propositions of which one is claimed to follow from the others, which are regarded as providing support or grounds for the truth of that one. So, in other words, an argument is when you say a few propositions and then something follows from those propositions. When you have a number of propositions that lead to a conclusion, you have an argument. So the conclusion of an argument is the statement that follows from the supporting propositions, which are called premises. So if you think of a building with a few pillars, the top of the building, the roof, is held up by those pillars. If you have a few pillars and they support that ceiling or that roof, then you've got an argument. You pull out all of the reasons for your conclusion, and you don't have a conclusion. You just got an opinion. So no propositions, no conclusion. So the conclusion of an argument is the statement that follows from your propositions, which are supporting it. Those are called premises. So you've got propositions. They're just statements about the world. You add them up to support a conclusion. That's called an argument. Those propositions within your argument are premises that support your conclusion. All right, I hope that was clear. Maybe a mouthful, but we'll point you to the written version of this so you can read it.
Right. So kind of the classic example of this would be all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Yes. Two premises and a conclusion that follows from the premises. So to reiterate, an argument is composed of premises that lead to a conclusion. And like I said before, a conclusion without premises is not an argument. It's merely an opinion. So if you say, well, vaccines are terrible or vaccines are great, that's your opinion. But if you haven't given any premises, reasons to support that conclusion, you don't have an argument. So it doesn't matter what view you're talking about. You can say, well, Chicago Bulls are the best. It's your opinion unless you say some propositions that support your conclusion that they're the best. Now you have an argument. Okay, so the building blocks of arguments can be recognized by telltale words. And the words that point to the conclusion can be called conclusion indicators. So let me just stop there. When we're reading something or we're hearing something, people don't spell out their argument. And so when you're studying logic, the first thing you need to sort of train yourself to do is extract the argument from the paragraph of whatever someone's saying. Sometimes someone can go on and on for a half an hour with emotive language and their opinions and go off on many bunny trails. In doing that, it's like, well, I guess I agree with them because they're so animated and they really sound convincing and they are so sincere. They are speaking with authority and boldness and they are convinced. And it's almost like the boldness they speak with or the certainty that they have can persuade you. But unless you start training yourself to say, what's his view or his conclusion, and what reasons has this person given to support that conclusion, you haven't identified what's this guy's argument or what's this gal's argument. Yeah.
Brian, I can't help but to think there of when you were talking about that person who sounds so sure and they sound so persuasive, I can't help but to think of Christopher Hitchens. I remember he did and I admire him for doing this, but he did a book tour and he wanted to go across the Bible Belt. And one of the places that he did it was in Texas. And he ended up at a table discussion at a book convention, I think it was. I'm not getting that exactly right, but it was Hitchens, Douglas Wilson, Lee Strobel, William Lane Craig, and there was another theologian, philosopher there. And I remember at one point, Hitchens went on this long response, I believe, to the fine-tuning argument. And Strobel simply said, I challenge anybody in this room to actually put what Christopher just said in any kind of logical format.
Yeah.
And so essentially what he was saying is that, look, that sounded really persuasive. But if you try to come up with some premises that lead to the conclusion he made, you're going to fail.
Yeah. And sometimes I'll hear something similar like, a complaint is not an argument. Your emotion is not an argument. So if we're going to make decisions based upon good reasons, or we're going to come to an agreed upon conclusion, oh, yeah, we should do this or that, or we should believe this or that. Well, we have to know what supports that. And so we have to pull those out. So back to what I was saying about the building blocks of arguments, you have to recognize them or extract them from what people are saying by looking for conclusion indicators. So conclusion indicators are the words that sort of point to the building blocks. For example, when someone says therefore, or hence, thus, so, Accordingly, or in consequence, consequently, as a result, it follows that, or we may infer that, which shows that, etc. These are all like words or phrases that often point to the conclusion of an argument. So someone's not going to say, my conclusion is such and such. They're going to say other words that would indicate. Sometimes they'll say it if it's more of an academic paper or something. They're going to state their view, and then they're going to defend their view and give all kinds of reasons. But in regular conversation, it's not going to be that way. You're going to have to pull it out, or if it's a news article or something, you're going to have to pull that out. So telltale words for premises can be called premise indicators. So things like since, or because, for, or the word as, or as follows from, or as shown by, is indicated by. The reason is, so these are sort of some of the words that can point to premises. Way easier maybe to digest that in written form. You'll have to train yourself to pick out from someone's speech or writing what are the signals that this is their supporting reasons. And sometimes there can be camouflage. You have to sort of guess if they don't make it very clear, or see what maybe missing premises there are. They just assume certain premises. So one point should be noted when you're seeking to identify arguments. There's a difference between an argument and an explanation. So remember that guy Copy, who was one of the co-authors of Introduction to Logic textbook. He says, many passages, both written and spoken, that appear to be arguments are in fact not arguments but explanations. The occurrence of certain premise or conclusion indicators such as because, for, and therefore cannot settle the matter, since those words may be used in both explanations and arguments. We need to know the intention of the author of the passage. If you're being a careful thinker, you have to be able to discern the difference between explanations and arguments by looking closely at the context and the intention. So there's two kinds of arguments, deductive and inductive. I'm shifting gears a little bit. So these are important to differentiate. So deductive. This basically means that the conclusion follows from the premises necessarily and conclusively. It's sort of like 2 + 2 = 4. It's certain, it's unavoidable. It follows necessarily. And it won't change. When an argument is deductive, it means that the conclusion follows from the premises necessarily and conclusively. And when the deductive argument is valid, it means that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So you plug in true information into those premises. If the logic is right, you're going to have a true conclusion. Now, an inductive argument is different. Deductive argument is almost mathematical in the sense that your logic is certain to give you a true conclusion, but inductive arguments, they're different in the sense that they're not conclusive. Things can change. When an argument is inductive, it simply means that the conclusion may be true to a certain degree of probability. So back to what Copy says in his Introduction to Logic, a deductive argument is one whose conclusion is claimed to follow from its premises with absolute necessity. This necessity not being a matter of degree and not depending in any way on whatever else may be the case. In sharp contrast, an inductive argument is one whose conclusion is claimed to follow from its premises only with probability, this probability being a matter of degree and dependent upon what else may be the case. So one way to look at this is as follows. In a deductive argument, no amount of additional information can change the conclusion of the argument. But in an inductive argument, the conclusion may change when new information is discovered. So you gave that example, Chad, of a deductive argument. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's a deductive argument. No new information is going to change that argument from being true. Okay, so maybe an example of some inductive arguments would be this. I see fireflies in my backyard every summer. So this summer I will probably see fireflies in my backyard. Here's another one. Every dog I meet is friendly. Your hypothesis or your conclusion would be most dogs are usually friendly. The more times something happens and you gather more and more data, the more certain you can be of that conclusion being true, but it's more only changing in probability. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You just keep adding data. Your conclusion is not certain from your premises. It just becomes more probable. It doesn't really prove the case if the premises are true.
Right.
If the premises are true, then it doesn't make it necessarily a strong argument. It's just stronger or weaker, you know?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. So in a deductive argument, the conclusion follows logically and necessarily, where in an inductive argument, your conclusion just follows either stronger or weaker.
Yeah, it's either going to help it to be more probably true or not.
Right.
That's maybe for one person, it might be persuasive, and another person not persuasive. So deductive arguments are certain, whereas inductive arguments are probable to some degree. So when an argument is structured correctly, it's called a valid argument. When an argument is not correctly structured, it's called invalid. So when we say something like, hey, you have a valid point, we're kind of taking the word and using it incorrectly, because valid is a word that describes an argument. It's either valid or invalid. An argument cannot be true or false. It can only be valid or invalid. So those are just technical points, so to speak, when we're looking at arguments and describing the language of structuring arguments and the premises and the different types of arguments. One we have not talked about is an abductive argument. It usually starts with an obviously incomplete set of observations and proceeds to the likeliest possible explanation for the data. So you might remember our interview with Dr. Stephen Meyer, and he talked about the return of the God hypothesis and inference to the best explanation. That would be called abductive reasoning. So the conclusion of an argument can be true or false because the conclusion is a statement, but the argument is only either valid or invalid. Finally, when an argument is valid and all its premises are true, it's called a sound argument. And that's the kind of argument the good thinker is looking for. So this has been a quick and dirty step 2 of our primer on the building blocks of logic. Like I said before, we talked about what logic is. These are the building blocks. We'll point you in the show notes to web pages that detail everything I've described here, along with some good books and websites where you can kind of do some further digging, because that's the only way you'll really master it. But hopefully this kind of gets your toes in the water for studying it further. As what we talked about before in the previous episode on this, that great quote by Geisler and Brooks, the next best thing besides godliness for a Christian is logic. And we tend to agree with that in many ways.
So, Brian, hopefully complementing or going right along with your series that you're doing on logic, which I think is extremely helpful and important, is one of the things that was interesting when I got into talking to people about questions of, does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Is the Bible reliable? Questions like that, is that I did begin to notice traits that people had that made them much easier to communicate with versus traits that people had that made them more difficult to communicate with. And hopefully it will become more clear as I talk about it. So this birthed a post that I wrote back in 2016. That is crazy. Called 7 Characteristics of a Mature Thinker. And I wanted to just kind of throw these out here for discussion, but also for thought for our listeners. And I think these are characteristics that if we put into practice, it will help us to not only think clearer, but also have better discussions with other people.
Yes.
So does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
So the first one is mature thinkers represent opposing views fairly and charitably. And for me, this is very important. It's very hard to have a discussion with somebody that comes at you with a version of your argument that you don't even represent, or they purposely make your argument weaker because it's easier to tear down. Now, obviously, in formal fallacy, we'd call that a straw man, but we don't need to know that. It's just important to know that it's important to represent other views fairly and charitably. And I actually have an example of somebody from Twitter this week that I wanted to read to you that I got. And I want you to tell me if you think this person represented my view fairly and charitably. By the way,
I've seen this.
I've never had a discussion with this person, ever. We've never had an interaction. And this is what he wrote. First of all, this is from Dopest Flyest OG Pimp Hustler Gangsta Playa. At Uncle Gross Toes. Yeah.
My.
Lovely. Right. So he wrote this. Chad, that's me. You believe a flying ancient rabbi, zombified undead magic genie carpenter man was born as a magic baby, came back from the grave and blasted off into outer space like Superman, and for some reason you call yourself an adult. Now, I, of course, retweeted it, and it said, this is a member of the skeptical community being charitable and showing me how to, in quotes, adult. Now, what was interesting about this interaction was that he continued to write some follow-up things, but the best part was when Real Atheology got on and said, fellow atheist here, please don't embarrass us.
Nice.
Which I thought was hilarious, and I much appreciated because they try to be very fair-minded as we do. So that would be an example of obviously this person not even trying to understand my view, not even taking the time to understand what I believe. He did not represent my view fairly or charitably at all. As you can see, this doesn't lay very solid ground for a productive conversation.
Obviously, he's not looking to have a discussion. He's looking to provoke you and mock you. None of that's an argument. It's all just, you're this. Okay.
Well, and I just thought was interesting. He sent up a follow-up tweet that criticized the idea that I believe he's going to be tortured in hell forever, for all eternity, and all these other things. And it was just so interesting because he never took the time to ask me what I actually believed. He just jumped to all these conclusions and just pushed all these preconceived biases, essentially, that he had on me, and all this dogma that he had swallowed, and just assumed that I held to all of it. And so I think a mature thinker is, again, going to represent views fairly, and they're going to be charitable. We should try to steel man a view as much as possible. That's why I quoted Charles Templeton in our podcast where we talked about, is it fair that Jesus is the only way to heaven? The reason I did that was because I wanted to steel man it, and I thought that he presented it very strongly and persuasively. And so that's what we should strive to do. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it applies not just from Christians versus skeptics, so to speak, or believer or non-believer, but between believers as well. When there are doctrinal differences or tertiary points of belief where they're going back and forth, we need to show the other people we're talking to that we can represent their view accurately to their satisfaction, and they can represent our view as well, because we don't want to be critiquing the wrong view, but we also want to show love and respect in the fact that we've actually taken the time to understand the other person's view, because otherwise it's just a sloppy critique. It's basically, you're wrong, and here, let me knock down this straw man. So, yeah, I think it applies to believers as well.
Amen. So the second characteristic that I've identified that, and of course there can be more of these, is that a mature thinker does not overstate their case. Now, I will freely admit that when I first got into apologetics, I had the approach that if I throw enough jello at the wall, jello being arguments, that something's got to stick, right? And I've since come to the conclusion that what I'm offering when I offer an apologetic to somebody is I'm saying, hey, this seems reasonable to me. Here are a couple reasons why I think it is reasonable. And you allow them to interact with it. You're not trying to overstate your case. You're not trying to slam dunk them. You're not trying to drown them with all the knowledge that you know.
Especially when you're using inductive arguments, too. Bringing it back to arguments. Some of the arguments we use are inductive, and you say, well, it seems reasonable to me that, say, Jesus rose from the dead, or that the Gospels are reliable, or that God exists. So when we're making an inductive case, we don't want to say that it's certain. I would rather say that there's strong evidence for something rather than say, here's proof.
Yeah.
And I think maybe long ago I said this on the podcast before, but when you say, hey, I'm going to tell you the funniest joke ever, get ready. No one will ever laugh at it, no matter how funny it is, because you just raise their expectations so high that it's not going to be funny. I'd rather say, hey, listen to this. And if they laugh, then wow, that's gravy.
Yeah, I really like that. This kind of goes along with that humble apologetic, doesn't it? Where you're not trying to beat the person that you're talking to or your opponent, depending on the setting. You're not trying to beat them over the head, but you're just offering rational justification. I love the title of Stephen Davis's book, Rational Faith. That's what it's called, Rational Faith. He's just saying, hey, here's why I think this is rational. Or Reasonable Faith, William Lane Craig's ministry. Hey, these are just reasons I think it's reasonable. And if we're allowing the Holy Spirit if we trust that the Holy Spirit's going to use arguments, we shouldn't have to overstate our case, right? I think that's a good principle, a characteristic of a mature thinker as well. Thirdly, a mature thinker will attack the argument and not the individual making the argument. What do you think of that one?
It's touching on the things we've said before, is that it's so easy to be offended, and it's like time and culture where people are just waiting to be offended so that they can complain or something, and no one's dealing with arguments. It's just calling names and name calling, and no progress is made. So basically we're talking about don't do ad hominems, don't attack the person, attack the argument.
I concur. I actually have come to the conclusion or to the place with social media or in discussions with people, whether it be in person or on the telephone, if it turns into them attacking me instead of an argument or the point that I'm making, I generally will not continue the conversation. Depending on the setting, I always try to end it respectfully and thoughtfully. I might say something along the lines of, well, when you get to a place where you're able to talk about this without insulting me, I'd be happy to do that. But unfortunately, sometimes you do have to be willing to do that, because usually if somebody is coming from the place of attacking the person and not the argument, the conversation's most likely not going to be very fruitful anyway. So the fourth one, I think this one's good. Acknowledge when there is a weakness in your case or your argument. So a mature thinker will say, hey, you know what? That is evidence for the other view. This was very well modeled by Jonathan McClatchy. If you'll recall, in our interview with Jonathan, he did point out that he thinks that there are things that make more sense on atheism, but he thinks that the balance of the scale tips toward theism. And I think that shows, again, the signs of a mature thinker.
When it comes to the problem of evil, he was saying that, yeah.
Yeah, that counts. He thinks that can count for evidence of atheism, but that ultimately the scale tips for theism overall. And so I think that when somebody points out something to you, if we're seeking truth, if we want to know what truth is, and somebody points out a weakness in our case or a weakness in our argument, we shouldn't be shy about pointing it out. Or at the very least saying, wow, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to need to look into that. So the fifth characteristic of a mature thinker can admit when they're wrong. And this is sometimes means you have to swallow some humble pie or admit that you have made a clear mistake. And it might be a moral mistake. It might be a logical mistake. I'll give you an example. I myself have been in an interaction with someone that I said something that was immature or silly or insulting or sarcastic. And I've had to come back and say, you know what? That was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And you're absolutely right when they've pointed it out to me.
I haven't had that situation ever happen in my life.
Whoa. I've actually never been wrong, so I've never had to admit that I'm wrong.
I'm sure one day I'll be wrong.
Right.
But until then.
Yes. Okay. Well, you heard it here, folks. So my sixth characteristic of a mature thinker is a mature thinker knows when to continue a discussion and when to end a discussion. And for me, this was a lesson that was very difficult to learn, because when I first began having these types of discussions about, I would say, more meaningful things, I thought that if I would eventually hang in the conversation long enough, first of all, my goal was to outlast them, or I would finally say something or share something that would change one's mind. But I think that we have to be discerning. And I think that part of that discernment is deciding, okay, is this person really seeming like they're a sincere seeker? Or are they just looking for an argument? Or is this even somebody that is worth spending the time on because they seem like they're open and really wrestling with these questions, or they really are just looking for someone to spar with? Like, I know I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that dopest, flyest, OG pimp, hustler, gangsta playa probably wasn't worth the time to chat with him after his complete straw manning of my position. Would that be fair to say?
Well, there is this phrase on the internet, don't feed the trolls.
Yes.
The troll is someone who is not there for a meaningful conversation, but just to stir the pot and to rile people up and waste people's time. If the person's goal is to waste your time, recognize it for what it is and just cut your losses, Maybe, you could spend a moment or two trying to figure out, well, maybe can I turn the conversation? No, okay, I'm not. Well, no explanation needed. We have better things to do, and they're just going to move on to the next victim,
Correct. All right, last one. Mature thinkers. Mature thinkers can acknowledge when someone that holds an opposing view makes a good point or has a good argument.
It's a good point.
If you are coming at this from, let's take it from the context Brian was talking about earlier, where let's imagine that you are an old Earth creationist and you're having a discussion with a young Earth creationist. There's nothing wrong with pointing out to the young Earth creationist, hey, you've made a really good point there. Or, hey, that's an argument I haven't thought of before. I'll have to look into that. That doesn't show weakness. That actually shows that, number one, you're open to following the evidence where it leads. And number two, you're respecting them as an individual. Now, of course, if we take it outside of the in-house discussions and debates, which I would say the age of the Earth definitely is, and we take it to something like the skeptical community, again, if a skeptic is able to point something out about a certain argument that you're sharing that you have not thought of, or if they have a rebuttal that is thought-provoking or challenging or shows that they're really thinking about it, I think it's not only honest to say, hey, that's a good point or a good argument, or I'll have to look more into that. But again, it shows them that you're listening, and it shows them that you are somebody that's worth spending time with discussing. What do you think about that, Brian?
Yeah, I think that's needed because, nobody wants to talk to someone who makes it very obvious that whatever you say, their view is not going to change. And you don't want to be that kind of person either, where you're so stuck in your position that you're unwilling to even listen, to understand, or to, like we were talking about before, like try to be able to steel man someone's argument or their view. So when someone else holds an opposing view, saying that, they make a good point, I think that's just being charitable. But back to what we were saying as well is, trying to not straw man someone's argument, but representing it in the strongest possible way, or steel manning the argument. That just shows respect, and it shows the fact that you're trying to interact with the best and the strongest arguments for each view. So why should we piddle around with the things that don't really, make good arguments on either side? You want to deal with the best. So that shows respect for your own thinking as well as the other person's view and them as a person, I think.
Yeah, great point. Great point. And if we model these 7 characteristics of a mature thinker, then I think that our interlocutor, as you like to say, is going to be more willing or more open or more apt to also practice these behaviors. And so yes. I think that's important. Now, Brian, I kind of prepared this, right? I wrote this 5 years ago. No, 6 years ago. What is going on? Anyway.
Back when the true president was sitting.
Wow. Well, that's the end of the show, folks. Have a good day. I'm out. No, I'm just kidding. So I wrote this several years ago. I wrote this post. I didn't really give you an opportunity. Is there something that, as we were going through these 7 characteristics of a mature thinker, that you perhaps thought, hey, Chad should have added this one? Was there something that stuck out, or was there something that you might say, well, hey, I've experienced this in my conversations?
I think the intellectual humility to know that just because you, say, earned a PhD, 10 years ago or something, it does not mean you're the smartest person in the room. You could be the most arrogant person in the room, maybe the most prideful, and think you're something when you're nothing. So I think those things I'm not saying I'm mature in my thinking, but I do think a mature thinker has a humility of their own inadequacies and thinks of themselves with sober judgment. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think I do. And I think maybe if I were to add it to the post, I would say something along the lines of mature thinkers always realize there's more to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that one philosopher, Christian philosopher I really appreciate and have benefited greatly from is Dr. Ken Samples. I just came across some more of his lectures that I listened to long ago, and I was like, oh man, I'd love to re-listen to these. But a lot of his stuff were about learning and how to learn and how to read a book and this idea of lifelong learning. Yeah, I just never want to get to the point where I don't have to learn anymore. Just entertain me, you know?
Yeah, and doesn't he model that humility that you're talking about?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think picking out heroes like that who are not only brilliant and fair and sharp and like written great books and things like that, but you know, when you talk to them, they're personable, they're humble, they embody all those things that you've said before. So the sort of like the culmination of the things that, like if you were just having those examples is really important.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for the podcast, and we hope you see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetics stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.